in January 1847, Ira Aldridge comes to Dublin, and I think we have to think of the context, because this is the start of Black 47, when Ireland is undergoing this awful famine and distress is apparent on the streets. And in Dublin itself there are soup kitchens in many locations, and Ira was not afraid to visit Dublin or Ireland at this stage. Later in the year he returns to Dublin, and he also performs in Belfast. So Ira would have seen the suffering of the famine firsthand. Again, remarkable. But I think what it also tells us is that most of his performances were full. And so even though this devastating famine is taking place in all parts of Ireland, normal life is still going on. There are still people who want to go to the theatre and who can afford to go to the theatre. And so it's a really interesting juxtaposition of what is happening. But again, it shows that Ira very much feels comfortable in Ireland, and he returns again in 1848 and is always warmly welcomed by the people and by the newspapers. Ira Aldridge, his origins are in some ways a mystery, and he very much contributed to that sense of mystery. What we think is true about him is that he was born in New York around 1807. Probably his father was called Daniel Aldridge. Daniel is often cited as being a minister. He was a Methodist minister, but he also had to make a living, and apparently he sold straw. At some stage, when a young boy, Ira decided he wanted to devote himself to the theatre. Now, according to some accounts, his father sent him to be a minister like he was, and Ira, the young Ira, rejected this. It's really hard to know the exact truth, but what we do know is that as a teenager, Ira and probably his elder brother, Joshua, were involved in a black theatre in New York. The African Grove Theatre in New York was unusual in that it was black actors and catered for a black audience, although white people attended. They, ironically, were forced to sit at the back. It was successful, but it was very short-lived. And the main actor was James or Jim Hewitt. And sometimes in biographies of Ira, they conflate the two figures, but they were two very different figures. Unfortunately, it caused some jealousy amongst white theatre proprietors, and they forced it to close down. So the African theatre in New York was short-lived, but it survived long enough to confirm in Ira his love of acting and his lifelong love of Shakespeare. Ira's involvement with the theatre not only gave him a love for Shakespeare, but it also provided him with an early example of racism, the fact that white theatres would not coexist alongside black theatres. It also gave rise to a comedy act. A very famous English comedian, now forgotten, Charles Matthews, was touring America. And when he came back, he made this into a stage show, literally called Tour of America. And in it, he claimed that he had seen a young black actor play Hamlet. And part of his act was to parody this young black actor playing and making a mess of Hamlet. The press was so powerful. When Ira came to England, he was a novelty, and he was not expected to be very good. Again, people who knew of Charles Matthews' trip to America expected somebody who would botch his lines, who wouldn't be able to enunciate clearly. And some of the critics then said they went with low expectations, but they were just blown away by the sophistication, the empathy that this young actor brought to his understanding of Shakespeare. And even though, as he was called, the African Roscius, in a very sarcastic manner, Ira took it and made that his own. And for a long time, playbills would refer to him as the African Roscius. But what's clear is by the 1850s, he wasn't happy being named in that way, and he started to refer to himself as the African Tragedian, referring to his role as a Shakespeare actor rather than just as an entertainer. But again, throughout this we see Ira always having agency, always wanting to define himself and not be defined by others. There's some confusion about what really happened in the young Ira's life. In some accounts, he ran away to sea for a while, and during one trip he found himself in Liverpool. On the voyage was a very famous English actor, James Wallach, who persuaded Ira to go to London and seek his fortune. According to other accounts, Ira was working with James Wallach in New York and then travelled with him to Liverpool. In Liverpool they parted company, and Ira then travelled on to London with a letter of recommendation. Again, it's very hard to know the truth, but what we do know is that this young man, he was a teenager, he was 17 or 18, around 1824, found himself in London and very, very quickly took to the stage in London. And again, as a teenager, he was playing Othello, a role that many older white actors feared to play. And this was a character Ira made his own. Throughout the rest of his life, wherever he performed, his opening performance would be Othello. And so he became very acclaimed for this role. But again, to emphasize the youth, he was a teenager performing in London, a major Shakespearean character. So pretty remarkable. Ira found himself in London, and one of the first theatres he performed in was the Coburg Theatre. And it was interesting because at the time there was sort of a snobbery attached to theatre performance, and there were a number of theatres, two in London and more throughout the country, that actually had what was called a royal patent, and they were called theatre royals. And for aspiring thespians, the place to act was ultimately in a theatre royal. But the main difference was that theatre royals had the right to perform what was called speaking plays, essentially serious plays. Each theatre would also follow a serious play by performing a farce. And very early on that became the pattern of Ira's entertainment. He would go on stage, perform very seriously in a Shakespearean tragedy, usually Othello. There'd be an interval, and then he would reappear and almost reinvent himself performing in a farce. The young Ira got the attention of the press, who followed his performances. And quite quickly they gave him a nickname which he adopted as his own, although initially it was meant sarcastically, and the name they gave him was the African Roscius, after a very famous Roman slave who was a brilliant actor. And so for maybe the first 3 decades of Ira's life, we see him referred to in the press as the African Roscius. In fact, so strong was that he never used his name, Aldridge. People didn't know that his name was Aldridge until the 1830s. He actually adopted a pseudonym, Cain, an Irish name, interestingly enough. So for many decades, the African Roscius was the name he was known by. One of Ira's major contributions is that from the very outset he challenged crude stereotypes. And in the 1820s, this is sometime before minstrelsy, sometime before Jim Crow song, but there was Charles Matthews and his trip to America, which was very, very popular. And from the outset, Ira was determined that he would challenge this crude stereotype. And we know from press reports, some of the audience and indeed some of the critics came to see Ira perform, believing he would really make a mess of Shakespeare. But they were astounded that this young man, who pretty well was self-trained, performed Othello with such dignity and had such a powerful stage presence. So very soon the critics took him seriously, but that's not to say that some of the reviews were not tinged with overt and covert racism. Ira spent the late 20s, mostly in London, in some English provincial theatres, really honing his craft as an actor and getting great reviews. Again, people would come for the novelty of a black performer, but they would go away amazed by how talented he was and how well he knew Shakespeare. In 1829, he was invited to Belfast, and that really started his, I would say, love affair with Ireland, because he appeared in Belfast and in other parts of Ireland many, many times throughout his life. He wanted also to perform in Dublin, and he was quite frustrated that he was not invited to Dublin. And according to his memoir, which is not always accurate, but he contacted the manager of the theatre, Mr. Calcraft, and said, "See me perform, and then decide if you want to see me act in Dublin." And at his own expense, he travelled to Dublin, and Calcraft was so impressed, he immediately offered him a job. So from 1831 onwards, we see Aldridge is a regular feature in the theatres of Dublin. Again, because of this hierarchy within the theatres, Aldridge always wanted to appear in the Theatre Royal in London and in the very prestigious Covent Garden in London. And they actually wrote to him in 1832 and said they would be interested, but he didn't really get his opportunity till 1833, when the great English white Shakespearean actor Edmund Kean fell ill and shortly afterwards died. And so Ira was invited to appear in Covent Garden and perform Shakespeare. Unfortunately, what we see is that although the audience loved him, his opening night was a great success. He was cheered by the audience, called back for a curtain call. The critics were very divided. And unfortunately, they seemed to be divided along lines of those who were for enslavement and those who were against enslavement. And some of the reviews, including those in the London Times, were openly offensive in their characterization of him in terms of describing him physically, his acting. So it must have been very hard for Ira. But Ira's appearance in Covent Garden has to be seen in the context of what was happening in the wider British Empire at the time, because in 1833 a bill was brought before the British Parliament to end slavery in the British Empire. So tensions were very high as this bill was moved through Parliament. And Aldridge, as a black actor, became very symbolic of this dispute that was going on. And so when we see him at Covent Garden, really he is being used by both sides of the debate, because he is now a public figure, a black public figure. It's pleasing to be able to say that the bill was passed through Parliament, and so as a result, on the 1st of August 1834, slavery was brought to an end in the British Empire. But for the young Ira Aldridge, who had grown up in a country that still practiced enslavement, it must also have been very poignant, because as we know, it took another 30 years for similar legislation in America. In Covent Garden, Ira played his favourite, Othello, and again played it beautifully. He played again a second night, but after that the performance was cancelled. And one of the criticisms of him was that he had responded to the curtain call. Some critics found that offensive, that purists did not respond to curtain calls. But Ira, because he responded to curtain calls, he would use his final night's performance as an opportunity to make a statement against enslavement. And it was something he'd written himself. It was a rhyming couplet, and it was very, very powerful. But what's also interesting is from this time, Ira reinvents himself. He did so a few times. And this reinvention is to say he was actually born in Africa and in Senegal. And this was a way of showing that he himself was very closely associated with enslavement and the plight of Africans. So even though Ira, it seems, never attended an abolitionist meeting, he was using his own platform, the stage, to make very, very powerful statements throughout the rest of his life, condemning enslavement. Ira's personal life was colourful, in fact, as dramatic off stage as he was on stage. When he was just 20, he married a young woman who was in the audience, Margaret Gill, who'd come to see him perform. And this is where we see Ira reinventing himself, and almost in a mischievous way in some ways, but he claimed that Margaret was the daughter of a member of the British Parliament. Of course she wasn't. Her father was very ordinary, probably a stocking weaver from Yorkshire. But again, this was Ira maybe throwing out false clues to people, and again just challenging the stereotype of seeing him in a certain way. It appears that he and Margaret never had any children together. A young boy was born 1848, 1849, the young Ira Daniel. And according to some accounts, his mother was Irish. We don't know, but we do know that Margaret brought young Ira up as her own. There are a number of illegitimate children that one actually led to a very famous court case in 1853, and it received a lot of newspaper coverage. But even though he doubted that he was the father of the child, Ira offered to pay for it. And this is something that is part of Ira. He was always very generous, always very compassionate. But back to his personal life, when he was doing one of his continental tours in the 1850s, he met a young Swedish woman who described herself as a singer. And sometime in the late 1850s, she relocated to London. After Margaret's death, Ira married the woman who had been his mistress, Amanda. But again, what was almost his trademark, mischievousness or trying to throw out false clues, he claimed she was from Swedish aristocracy. Of course, she wasn't. But this was something, again, that Ira, he didn't want to share his real life, and why should he? So he made up his alternative life. So with Amanda, he had 3 children, one of whom was born actually before Margaret died. And the children were interesting, not always having happy lives, but his 2 daughters actually had successful careers in opera, and his youngest daughter, Amanda, is generally thought to have given elocution lessons to the great Paul Robeson. So what's interesting is that after Ira appears in Dublin, he seems to have developed a love affair with Ireland. And shortly after the disaster in Covent Garden, he, Margaret, moved to Ireland. And effectively for about 7 or 8 years, they live in Ireland. And while there, they tour from place to place. Of course, Ira is quite flamboyant and likes to arrive in any town he visits in his coach with the props, the scenery behind him, etc. So he cuts quite a figure. Throughout the 1830s, Ira plays in many of the smallest towns in Ireland, places like Ballina, Kinealy, places that are really remote and out of the way, places that don't even have theatres. They make makeshift theatres so he can perform. And everywhere he goes, the audience are full and they love him. So when I think about Black Abolitionists who toured Ireland, they toured the major towns. They went to Cork, to Limerick, to Dublin, Belfast. But here is this black actor who is an abolitionist, who is touring and living in Ireland for a number of years, and really living his life in the smallest out-of-the-way places. And I just wonder what people in Tuam in 1835 made of this larger-than-life character who was living amongst them and then performing in front of them in the evening. So in this sense, he's really, I think, bringing his message to a lot more people than people like even Frederick Douglass did, because all his performances are covered in the local newspapers. And again, what's interesting is when he first comes to Ireland, some of the press in Dublin talk about the way he'd been treated in England, particularly by the London press, and they they say he won't find any of that offensive racism in Ireland. And indeed, it seemed that Ira, like many other black abolitionists, from the very first moment of setting foot in the country, felt a sympathy and an empathy, and he felt very comfortable staying in Ireland, living there for most of the 1830s. In addition to his acting, he was also a talented musician, and he would often sing in the second part of the performance, and he played a Spanish guitar, which he would often accompany himself. So, an all-round entertainer. Two things that I think are really interesting about him. He was somebody who was very generous, and when he performed in the town, he often liked to help support a local philanthropic, a local charity. And when he was in Tuam, he heard that they were building a Catholic cathedral. And so he donated the proceeds of some of his performances for this Catholic cathedral. Again, he's a man who's not Irish, who's not Catholic, and the great Bishop John McHale even praised him. And Catholic priests from the pulpit in the town said, "Go and see this man perform." So again, this man who could cut across religious divides and so many divides. And then when he was performing in Dublin in 1839, the night of his benefit, where the proceeds would be for Ira Aldridge, we know that somebody in the audience was the very famous Daniel O'Connell. And he was there with his children. And we know Daniel O'Connell was a great abolitionist. And what did he think as he saw this black man perform Shakespeare on a Dublin stage? It must have been quite a moment. It's difficult to know if he met any other black abolitionists. We do know that William Wells Brown, who visited Ireland in 1849, attended one of Ira Aldridge's performances and just spoke of him in glowing terms and how he was just doing so much to show that black people were the equal of white people. And Frederick Douglass, it's not known if they ever met, but Frederick Douglass wrote glowingly in his newspapers about this black man who was performing Shakespeare with such dignity. And then the other black abolitionist who did meet him in actually 1835 in Liverpool was James McCoon Smith, who had actually gone to school in New York with the young Ira, and he had then left North America. He wanted James McCoon Smith to be a doctor. Nowhere in America would accept him, so he went to Glasgow and trained to be a doctor, did his residency in Paris, and then returned to America to fight for abolition. But he met Margaret and Ira while they were all in Liverpool, and he spoke again and wrote glowingly of Ira and said that Ira is doing more to show that black people are the equal in arts than anybody else. So really Ira, even though he may not have met many black abolitionists, was seen very much as their champion and as somebody who was promoting their cause, but in a very, very different way. In the 1850s, there was much polarization in the United States as abolition had a number of defeats, essentially. But in Britain, abolition was revived by the appearance of Harriet Beecher Stowe's book, Uncle Tom's Cabin. And she actually visited Britain. She became the darling, especially of upper-class abolitionists in Britain. Black abolitionists were a bit more ambivalent about her writing. But a few years later, she wrote a book that was even more polemical than Uncle Tom's Cabin, called Dread, and about a man called Dread who escaped from enslavement and lived in the so-called dismal swamps and helped other people escape from enslavement. He was very militant, and he actually killed a plantation owner, which led to his own killing. And Dread was seen as being much more forceful than Uncle Tom's Cabin in the message it was promoting, and it actually outsold Uncle Tom's Cabin for a while, even though it's now fallen from favour. But Ira must have read this, and within a few months of this book coming out, he actually collaborated and adapted it as a stage play. But he chose to show it in Ireland, and he performed it in Belfast. Some mixed reviews, but then he took it to Cork along with scenery that he'd had specially designed, and in Cork it was very, very well received. But But what's interesting, he never performed this play outside of Ireland. He only performed it to Irish audiences. Ira performed in Ireland throughout the 1830s, and then after 1839 he returned to Britain and was performing in the provincial theatres, always hoping he would be invited back to London and to one of the prestigious Theatre Royals. That didn't happen. It just didn't happen. There were rumours, but it didn't happen. And at this stage, Ira is really experimenting with some of the plays. He wasn't just an actor. One example of his stagecraft and his creativity was he revived a Shakespeare play that hadn't been performed for 200 years, Titus Andronicus. And again, he brought it to Irish audiences where he knew it would be well received. So even though his first love is always Shakespeare and Othello is always at the front of that, he's starting to help adapt plays. And what's interesting is plays with black characters or characters who are caricatured. He starts to present them, but he subverts them and he presents them in a sympathetic way. And one famous example is Shylock. Shylock was traditionally seen as a Jew, and Jews, as you know, there was a lot of prejudice against Jews and they were caricatured. He played Shylock as a sympathetic character, and he played him often wearing a white mask, but he would keep one of his hands free of a glove to show he was really black. And people who saw it were sort of amazed because they'd never seen Shylock portrayed sympathetically. And at a time of anti-Jewish prejudice, this was really brave to take Shakespeare and to invert him in that sense. So it shows the agency of Ira Aldridge, still a young man. One of the plays that Ira brought to Ireland, actually in 1847, was a French play called The Black Doctor. And it's set at the time of the French Revolution. Somebody who'd formerly been a slave escapes, trains to be a doctor, marries a white woman, but eventually, like all of the characters that Ira played, comes to a sad ending simply because of his colour. And this was a play that Ira had helped to adapt for the stage in Ireland. Aldridge's successes in the 1830s and 1840s coincided with the rise of the minstrel shows. And sometimes he would be performing in one theatre and the theatre across the road would be featuring a minstrel show. And again, you can only imagine how disconcerting this was. Minstrel shows were essentially a collection of white performers who would don a blackface, usually burnt cork, and then pretend to be black people, but do it in the most exaggerated, grotesque manner. But it was really popular. In the mid-1830s, a man who's seen, in many ways, the father of the minstrel shows, who had Irish background, Timothy Dartmouth Rice, visited Ireland, and he performed his trademark song, Jump Jim Crow, and it became the most popular song probably of the decade. And the minstrel shows would perform songs like this, but again, everything in a very exaggerated manner. And what's interesting about Ira Aldridge is he started to include Jim Crow in his performances, and he sang it. And the reason isn't fully known, but it just seems that he almost appropriated this song that had been used so offensively. He almost took ownership of it. And of course, with the audiences, it was really popular, although some critics noted the difference between him as an authentic black person and the falseness of the minstrel performers. But this was something he and other serious performers had to contend with. By the late 1840s, as music halls were opening, more theatres were opening, it seems that popularity of Shakespeare is in decline. And what's interesting is that even though Ira continues to perform Shakespeare as often as possible, the proportion of his Shakespearean performances compared with melodramas and as they were called, Negro songs, is actually changing. And so this might be what persuaded Ira to accept an invitation to perform in the continent after 1852. Ira went to the continent, first performed in Belgium, and then travelled to other major theatres in Europe. Interesting for a number of reasons. Initially, he had a troupe with him, then he just travelled alone. But wherever he went, Ira would always perform in English, but those around him would speak the local tongue, whatever it was. And the audiences in Europe loved Ira. And they loved Shakespeare, so ironically, on the continent, Ira Aldridge was able to perform more Shakespeare than he was being allowed to perform in England, the home of Shakespeare. And so for the rest of his life, Ira Aldridge spends many, many months and years performing in Europe, as far as Moscow, to the east of Moscow, Constantinople, Sweden, Paris. He performs all over the continent, and he is much beloved. When he was in Europe, he didn't just perform in front of audiences, he performed in front of royalty. The King and Queen of Prussia went to see him, and they gave him a major accolade. And in Sweden, the King and Queen of Sweden actually invited him across, and they gave him a major accolade. In the Netherlands, he also performed before the King and Queen. Interestingly, they didn't give him an accolade, and it's thought because he performed Shylock and because he spoke out against enslavement. And at that stage, the Netherlands still had slaves. So it seems in his later years, Ira very much felt comfortable performing on the continent. Ira died in Poland, and again, he was very beloved for the Polish people, and they buried him there with honours. It's really interesting because the fact he chose to spend so much time in Ireland tells us how much he felt comfortable there. And when writing about him, James McCoon Smith outlines his friend. It was in Ireland he got the warmest receptions and where he felt most comfortable and free of racism. So again, it seems that Ireland was a place where he could feel comfortable about being a black person and also comfortable about being a black person who was married to a white woman. Because at this stage, and right up to the 1960s in some areas, that was forbidden in parts of America, and indeed it was forbidden in some parts of Europe. So again, it was a very brave statement to be married to a white woman. But it seems in Ireland he felt very accepted for making these choices. In 1867, the year of his death, Ira had finally committed to returning to America. He hadn't been there since he left in 1824, and he was booked in a theatre in New York with other performances to follow, but of course he never made it back. And it almost seems a shame that he hasn't had, to this day, more recognition in the country of his birth, because he really was such an inspiration to contemporary abolitionists on both sides of the Atlantic.